This program is brought to you in part by Norelco patented lift and cut shavers. We make close comfortable.
Everything humanly possible is being done for their recovery. We have not given up.
Put on your knee pads and your safety toes.
Throughout history, mining has been one of the most dangerous occupations in the United States. At the turn of the century, men worked with primitive equipment. On average, 1,900 miners died each year. The fatality rate remained high until recent years, when modern machinery and improved mining techniques were combined with tougher safety rules and regulations. But still, the danger remained. Hello, I'm Joe Witte, and welcome to Disaster Chronicles. One of the events that changed mining history in this country occurred in Farmington, West Virginia, a tiny community 100 miles south of Pittsburgh. Up to that time, Farmington's claim to fame had been as the hometown of Sam Huff, the legendary linebacker for the New York Giants and later the Washington Redskins. But for 10 days in 1968, Americans were focused on this town and the dramatic story of 78 of its residents. This is the heart of coal country, USA. Generations of men have spent most of their working days underground. The Consol No. 9 mine, owned by a subsidiary of the Consolidation Coal Company, was originally opened in 1910, November 20, 1968. Just after 5:30 in the morning, a giant explosion rocked the mine. Smoke began pouring from the shafts. Underground, several miles from the explosion, a whoosh was heard, and a number of miners realized something was terribly wrong. 13 were able to scramble to safety on their own power. 8 others crawled to the bottom of the shaft, where they found enough oxygen to breathe. They waited almost 5 hours before a portable crane could lift them to the surface. By 10:40 that morning, 21 miners were safe. The first explosion was so massive, it rocked homes in the area and devastated the miners' lamp house, where the records of men working on that shift were kept. After phoning the miners' homes all day, they established that 78 men were missing. It wasn't long before their families and friends came to the mine.
The company store not far from mine headquarters served as a temporary command post and a place to wait for some news. There were as many mothers waiting today as there were wives. Many of the missing men were young, part of a new shift that had just been added in recent weeks. Unofficially, one mine inspector said there's not a chance in the world to get those men out. Officially, no one cares to say that.
Ken Heckler was a congressman from West Virginia at the time.
There was a feeling that maybe, just maybe, there might be a pocket of closed off a section of the mine where they had enough air and where they didn't have to breathe carbon monoxide, where they might have been able to escape.
During the first night, fire spread, and the next day, smoke was pouring out of the 2 shafts coming up from the mine. Despite the pessimism, company officials said they would not give up. William Poundstone was executive vice president of Consolidation Coal Company.
At this time, we do not intend to seal the entire mine in order to shut off the air supply to the fire. We are still running mine ventilation fans so that the men, if the men are alive, they can get oxygen. The only reason we would seal up all the portals and shafts is if all other attempts to contain the fire and reach the men have failed.
For days, there were more explosions, and the fires continued to spread. Miners from other ships who had come to comfort the families were openly critical of safety standards at the mine. They pointed to violations of safety requirements that had turned up in federal inspections in the past 5 years. And they recalled 2 previous fatal explosions at the mine, then under different ownership, in the past 14 years. The charges of safety violations were denied by the company and by the United Mine Workers. Lewis Evans was the union safety director.
Anyone who has worked in a coal mine, as I have, and as the men at this mine have worked in this mine, know that conditions in coal mines can change hourly. A mine can be an entirely safe mine today and completely unsafe tomorrow, or an hour from now, or 10 minutes from the time it was safe.
The wait continued. 6 days had now gone by, and hopes were growing dimmer and dimmer. There had been 20 underground explosions since the first one.
2 rescue squads came out of the mine last night and said carbon monoxide gas forced them to turn back at points 2 to 4 miles away from where the men are thought to be trapped. The rescuers said they saw no signs of survivors. Further exploration by rescue teams was postponed indefinitely because of new fires and explosions in the mine early this morning.
Meanwhile, drilling teams continued to look for more sites to bore holes where the men were believed to be trapped. Microphones lower down had not picked up any signs of life.
Nothing but water so far. I think those little cracking sounds are probably little stones that are falling off in that 700-foot hole.
Air samples had all shown high concentrations of explosive methane gas and carbon monoxide. The next day, 8 days after the first explosion, Consolidation President John Corcoran made it clear there was little hope of rescuing the 78 trapped men. Family members pleaded for the rescue operations to continue.
Somebody down there is in the right place at the right time, barricaded, waiting for help. And this is what they're trained to do. And we have to keep drilling until at least a month. I just can't see how we could give up hope without being 100% sure that there's no life there. I'm speaking for the families of the 70.
I know you are. I know you are.
My own family.
I realize that, and I appreciate what you're saying. And this is why we're doing everything we know to do to accomplish that result.
It was Thanksgiving week. 78 food packages had been assembled for the families of the trapped miners. A supermarket in nearby Fairmont had donated 17-pound turkeys, and the United Mine Workers provided the rest of the groceries. The holiday came and went. Still, no words of encouragement. The next day, November 29th, 1968, 10 days after the first explosion, representatives of the company, the United Mine Workers, and state and federal authorities concluded that all rescue efforts had been unsuccessful, and that since air samples did not contain enough oxygen to sustain life, the mine should be sealed. 78 men would be left buried 700 feet below Farmington. The explosion raised many questions about the safety at Consol No. 9 and throughout the coal fields of Appalachia.
There was a kind of attitude that production was far more important than protection.
Disaster Chronicles continues in a moment on A&E. The recovery and investigation took 10 years, and even now, we don't know the precise cause of the explosions, but there are a number of factors which may have contributed. Federal investigators believe the first explosion was caused by inadequate ventilation. Other contributing factors were the weather. As winter approaches, low pressure and cold, dry air reduce the amount of moisture underground, thus drying out the mine. Inadequate rock dusting, a process which reduces the combustibility of the coal dust. Accumulations of loose coal and coal dust, and insufficient testing for methane gas. Many in West Virginia had questioned safety practices at the mine. There had been complaints that this was a gassy mine. It was so large that it was difficult to ventilate. One foreman later testified that the night before the first explosion, production had been stopped for several hours because of high levels of methane gas. West Virginia attorney Davitt McAteer is an expert on mining and has studied the Farmington disaster.
Consolidation number 9, Consol number 9, was known as a hot mine, was known as a dangerous mine, and was known as a mine where the management ran roughshod over health and safety concerns of the miners. And in fact, there had been miners who complained at that particular mine about the conditions of that particular location, and had been demoted, who had been reprimanded, and who did not have union help, and they couldn't get any help in terms of finding protection.
And who was to blame? Again, former Congressman Ken Heckler.
There was a kind of attitude that production was far more important than protection. And since this mine was a big producer, why the emphasis was entirely on production instead of protection. The responsibility has to be shared between the operators of that mine as well as the United Mine Workers Union at that time, which was not as aggressive as it should have been.
The mine remained sealed for almost a year. The following September, operations to recover the bodies of the 78 men began. The recovery continued for 9 years. In that time, 59 bodies were found. The mine was sealed for a final time, November 1st, 1978, when it became apparent the chance of finding the remaining 19 men was remote. Mining has long been a hazardous profession. More than 20,000 miners have died in West Virginia since the turn of the century. Safety concerns, which had been a priority during the 1930s and 40s, gave way to mechanization and higher yields per man hour as the coal industry faced greater competition from oil and gas after World War II. In the 60s, many in the United States took for granted the dangers of coal mining. That alarmed many who had been at Farmington in 1968, including New York Times correspondent Ben Franklin.
People started arriving, I think, first from the state of West Virginia. The governor of West Virginia, Hewlett Smith, arrived and said essentially what everybody else began to say, that mining is a hazardous business, and as long as the men go into the ground to dig coal, they will die.
We've had a tragedy here as we've had many times before, but still we must recognize that this is a hazardous operation, a hazardous business, the mining as a profession, as a training period for men today, and that what was occurred here is one of the hazards of being a miner.
Well, I was surprised to hear, but he was a politician, you know, he was making excuses for the most important industry in his state. But then came the federal officials, and the Assistant Secretary of Interior, Cordell Moore, flew up in a government plane and held a news conference and said, this is a safe company. We have confidence in it, but as long as men go into the ground to dig coal, they will die.
We have tried our very best to do everything we can to make mines safe. And I think that the company here has done all in its power to make these mines safe. Unfortunately, these things, we don't understand why they do happen, but they do happen.
That's how it is, you know, that's coal biz. I found that rather astonishing, not knowing too much at that point about the U.S. Bureau of Mines. And then appeared Anthony Boyle, Tony Boyle, the president of the United Mine Workers Union, who said, as long as men go into the ground to dig coal, they will die. And that absolutely astounded me.
This happens to be, in my judgment as president of the United Mine Workers of America, one of the better companies as far as cooperation and safety is concerned to work with. It's a sad commentary that this thing has to happen anywhere, but more especially here. I know what it is to be in an explosion. I've gone through several of them. And as long as we mine coal, there's always this inherent danger connected with mining of coal.
At the time, some of the toughest comments on the mine safety issue came from Interior Secretary Stuart Udall, whose department included the Bureau of Mines.
I don't think the industry people have done enough. I don't think the labor unions have done enough. I don't think my department has done enough in this field of coal mine safety. I think we've been too complacent, and that's the reason that I don't think we can simply sit back and accept it. I don't think it's acceptable that we simply shrug our shoulders and say, well, we're going to have disasters of this kind from time to time.
Interior Secretary Udall called a mine safety conference in Washington the next month to push for tougher mine safety regulations. And Congressman Ken Heckler became one of the most vocal advocates on Capitol Hill. We'll trace the long and deadly road of mine legislation when Disaster Chronicles continues. Disaster Chronicles continues on A&E. The Farmington accident was a watershed that set in motion a chain of events that led to the most sweeping mine safety law in history. Americans demanded a solution to the problem of mine safety. Since 1900, mine accidents have caused more than 100,000 deaths in the United States. Monongah, West Virginia, only 12 miles from Farmington, and part of the same rich vein of coal known as the Pittsburgh seam. At the turn of the century, coal was king. It had fueled the spread of the Industrial Revolution. America had become the world's leading coal producer. Economic growth was so rapid in the coal states that companies looked to Europe to recruit workers. For the men and boys who found work in the coal mines, it was a harsh life. Miners worked long hours under dangerous conditions, barely earning enough to support their families. David McAteer.
The notion was that it was unconstitutional to regulate industries, that corporations could and should operate in an unfettered and unregulated manner in all aspects. And that was the American way.
The coal industry flourished, but at a terrible cost in human life. More miners died in the coal industry's first 50 years than at the worst battles of the Civil War. And then, a few weeks before Christmas in 1907, a huge explosion devastated the workings of two connected mines at Monongah. The damage was massive. Recovery efforts took days. The official death toll reached 362. 3 more accidents that December pushed the total of mine deaths to more than 3,000 for the year. The nation took notice. President Theodore Roosevelt called the number of deaths appalling. A conference was convened, hearings were held, and in 1910, the Bureau of Mines was born. But change did not come quickly, and the death toll mounted. Mining was America's most dangerous profession, leading all other industries in job-related death and injury. When labor gained momentum in the 1920s and 30s, the United Mine Workers were in the vanguard, and heading the UMW was a controversial, fiery leader who saw safety as the union's role and his role. His name, John L. Lewis. After the government took control of mining operations to assure adequate production during World War II, Lewis negotiated groundbreaking safety provisions for union miners.
The point was that an individual miner could say, in effect, to his foreman or to his own safety guy, I'm not working that job. That job's unsafe. I'll get killed if I work that job. I'm not doing it. And not get fired.
Safety issues had gained a foothold, and modern equipment was reducing some of the risk to miners. But the riddle of mine safety had yet to be solved. Miners were still dying. It would take another holiday tragedy, this one in Illinois, just before Christmas in 1951, to spur further congressional action. After the accident, John L. Lewis testified before Congress.
Those who consume coal and you and I who benefit from that service because we live in comfort, we owe protection to those men first, and we owe the security for their families if they die.
The 1952 Coal Mine Safety Act was the most significant piece of legislation for miners since the creation of the Bureau of Mines in 1910. It provided for annual inspections in underground mines and set safety standards. Even though enforcement and penalties were limited, the 52 law did help the cause of mine safety to inch forward. The 1952 Act remained in place for 16 years, virtually unchanged, and was in effect in November 1968 when the Farmington accident occurred. That accident, again during the holiday season, created a groundswell for reform which led to one of the most comprehensive occupational safety laws in U.S. history. After a year of debate, Congress passed the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act of 1969. The bill radically altered the government's role in mine safety and also provided benefits for miners suffering from black lung disease. Since Farmington, increased vigilance and mechanization have greatly reduced mine deaths and injuries. Fewer miners are placed at risk, and production rates have nearly doubled.
Remember, we're the most productive miners in the world, in this country. Better than anybody. We've got the best equipment, we've got the best machines. It is our, I mean, if you look to industries and we talk about productivity in this country being a challenge for American labor, not in the mines, Doctor, we are the best miners in the world, bar none. And so we ought to protect these guys. We ought to protect them and make them the safest working places we can because they're the best in the world.
Mining remains a dangerous profession. But today, American mines are the safest they've ever been. Since the 1968 Farmington accident, modernization has transformed the coal industry. The pick and shovel days are a distant memory. But the people of Appalachia have not forgotten the 78 Farmington miners who, along with thousands before them, sacrificed their lives in the long struggle for health and safety in the coal mines. Thanks for joining us on Disaster Chronicles. I'm Joe Witte.
It's a living history of one incredible century, as told by 100 extraordinary Americans. Phil Donahue, Oprah Winfrey, and Mike Wallace are among the class of the 20th century.